Hey everybody, we're going to continue our rendering with Redshift in ZBrush series, and this one's going to go much more in depth than the previous quick start video. So in this video we're going to cover assigning materials and colors, modeling techniques for rendering, lighting using ZBrush lights and HDR images, render size, shadow catchers, saving custom materials, depth of field, Polypaint versus preset materials, more material settings along with some online resources, and finally rendering a scene with an animated camera. So by the end of this video, you should have a pretty good idea of where all the menus and buttons are, and of course, it's going to be a long video, so if you need to skip ahead to specific information, check out the chapters, go directly to the information you need, and let's get started. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is make sure we have the updated version of ZBrush and Redshift using the Maxon app. So you can see we're up to date here. Go ahead and launch ZBrush, and we're going to set up a really simple scene file just to make sure you can follow along. So I'm going to go in here to our palette, and we're going to choose a Sphere 3D, drag that on our canvas, go into edit mode, make Polymesh 3D, and we'll go ahead and open up our subtool menu here. So we have a Polymesh sphere that we can go in and sculpt on if we want to. And then to this, I'm going to say append a cube, and then append a arrow. So for this cube, we're going to hit W, and we're going to scoot this over to the right. We're going to hold down Alt and move that gizmo down. And we're going to scale this cube down a bit. We're going to select our arrow here. We're going to move that out in front, and we're going to rotate this so it's pointing forward. And again, we're going to scale this down a little bit. So this is just a few objects that we're going to render using the Redshift renderer. And there's going to be some problems with these objects. This is why I'm choosing them specifically, but we're going to solve those problems. So now by default, if we go up here in this BPR button up here, you'll see the shortcut for that is Shift R. If we hit that, that's going to do a BPR render. That's ZBrush's default renderer, but we want to do a Redshift render, something that's going to be very nice and ray trace and have super nice materials and lighting. So what we're going to do, we're going to swap our default renderer out with our Redshift renderer. You'll see I have my brush menu docked over here on the left. You see these little double arrow dividers. You can double click those to open this side up, and we're going to take this brush menu and just click that little dot and get rid of that. And then over here, we're going to grab our render menu, grab that white dot, and drag that over here so we can always have that open so we can look at what we're doing here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to open up this Redshift renderer submenu and click on this Redshift button. What that's going to tell ZBrush is every time I hit this BPR render or hit Shift R, it's going to kick off a Redshift renderer. The first time you do that, it's going to want to initialize Redshift, send the data over. So it's going to take a little bit longer, but once it's done that, every subsequent render should go a little bit faster. So here you're going to see instead of the BPR render, we're going to get a nice ray traced render. Now, one thing we forgot to do was turn on our perspective. Right now we're rendering an orthographic view, which looks a little bit weird. So to make this look a little bit more natural, I'm going to go up here and turn on perspective, or hit P on your keyboard. And you're going to see instead of that nice render, we're back to just our viewport. So every time we hit that BPR render, it's going to fill our document with a very nice render, but as soon as you touch or move or change anything, it's going to want to kick you out into just the ZBrush default viewport. Don't worry, all of your renders are saved. If you go down here to BPR pass, and your BPR renders are all stored in here, and then our Redshift AOV passes, same thing. We have a bunch of passes in here. So you didn't lose anything. The render that you kicked off is still saved as an image, but we'll get to the render passes in another video. So if we want to get that nice render back, all we got to do is, again, hit Shift R, hit BPR. However, our objects are kind of floating in a gray void. So what if we want a plane for these to sit on? Of course, you could go in here and append a plane 3D and scale it, put it beneath your objects and scale it. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the easy route. We're going to go over here to floor and turn that on, or hit Shift P, and that's going to put a plane that's basically stuck to the lowest subtool in your scene. And what I mean by that is if we take the draw menu here and we dock it over to the left, temporarily, you're going to see the elevation for this floor is set to -1. What that means is if I alt tap my cube here and hit W and then move this down and then rotate my scene, you're going to see that floor is automatically going to snap to that cube because it's the lowest object in my scene. If I undo that by hitting Control Z, that floor is going to raise up. So this is a nice, easy way to have a floor in your scene. Or more likely, what we're going to get to later is the shadow catcher. And speaking of, it's going to be a long video, so if you want to skip ahead, go to the chapters and look and see if there's a subject that you want to see specifically. But we're gonna get the shadow catching in a bit. But for now, we just have a floor plane that is always going to be rendered in our scene as long as that floor button is turned on. Now, here's a fun fact: if you take this elevation and set it to 0, this will show you the actual world axis. So that is the 0, 0, 0 of your world. But again, by setting this to -1, it's going to snap to the lowest subtool that you have in your scene. Also, grid size, we can make this floor bigger or smaller if we want. I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 3. And if we keep scrolling down, you're going to see we have a store cam in here. So if you want to keep, your camera, you want to move your camera around to see your other objects, but you always want to snap back to your original camera view, all you have to do is go in here and say store cam. We'll call this front corner. And now we have a front corner camera. If I want to, rotate my camera around and then do another store, we could say back corner. And now we can switch between front corner and back corner, or click on this drop down, so we can go through very quickly and snap our camera back. So if we move this camera around and then we would say I want to go back to back corner, just click that and it'll go to back corner, or again we can use these arrow keys to go to the front corner. Also, one thing I should mention is when we have our perspective turned on, you're going to see it's actually turning on in here in our draw menu, as well as we have our, if we hover over this, that's our universal perspective camera. You can go through here and change your focal length for your camera. We'll go ahead and keep that set at 50, but this is all your camera controls, and of course, like we were talking about, our floor plane controls. So we'll go ahead and close out of our draw menu here. And let's talk a little bit about material assignment and how that works inside of ZBrush, because if you're coming from another program, it might be a little bit different than what you're used to. So if we back this camera out and we hit BPR, again, this has Redshift. We have Redshift renderer turned on, so it's going to kick off a Redshift renderer. Right now, I have a startup material assigned to all of my objects, including my floor plane. So how do we assign a material to a floor plane and to our individual objects? Well, the floor plane is easy. All you have to do is right underneath Redshift button right here, there is a flat color assigned to the floor plane material. All that means is whenever I swap this material out, say if I choose the matte cap droplet material, number one, it's going to change all of these objects to that material, and I'll tell you why in just a second, but it's also going to change the floor plane to that material as well. And that's because this floor plane material is set to flat color, which just means it's going to inherit whatever material I have selected. However, if I want a specific material assigned to this floor plane, just click it and go in here and we'll choose, again, we want this to be a nice Redshift renderer, right? So instead of using matte cap materials or standard ZBrush materials, which you can do, you can see we're rendering matte cap just fine. I'm going to use Redshift materials. They're going to be much more accurate for our rendering needs here. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to choose simple metal chrome for our floor material. And then I'll choose, we'll do a Redshift plastic material. So now when I hit send off a BPR render or a Redshift render, you're going to see now our objects are being rendered with a plastic material and our floor plane is being rendered with that chrome material. Now, when we chose that plastic material, you're going to see there's two categories in here, and we're going to get more into material settings in just a bit. But this one is Redshift Polypaint Materials. That means the vertex color of the object or the polypaint of the object is going to control the color. And then these preset color materials down here means the color is going to be built into the material. So for now, we're going to stick with the Redshift Polypaint Materials. And again, we chose plastic. However, if I go from plastic and say, you know what, let's go check that simple chrome material out. If I choose that one, it's going to fill all of my objects with that simple chrome. If that's what you want, along with the simple chrome selected in here, that's totally fine. And again, when we kick off a render, everything is rendered with chrome. However, let's say I want all three of my objects to be plastic and I want a chrome plane down here. So if I switch this back to Redshift Plastic, there we go. Now we have all of our subtools are plastic and then our floor is chrome. However, what if I want different colors for all of our objects? Well, like I told you, we can use Polypaint for that. So if I Alt tap our sphere right here and we go in here, I'm going to take the color menu. I'm going to dock it temporarily over here to the left. You're going to see there is a color menu fill object button in here. So if I want to fill this with a plastic material and let's say a light blue color, if I go in here, we have the standard brush selected. I'm going to turn off Z-Add and I'm going to turn on mRGB. So what that means is material and color, RGB and material. When I hit this color fill object, it's going to fill all the verts of this object with the plastic Redshift material along with whatever color we have selected. So in this instance, I'm going to choose light blue. And then with mRGB selected, I'm going to say color fill object. Now what you're going to see happen is over here on the subtool menu, you're going to see this little paintbrush icon is going to turn on. If we go down here to our Polypaint menu, you're going to see there's a Colorize button. This Colorize button, when I turn this on and off, is actually controlling this paintbrush icon. They're the same thing. So whenever you fill an object with a color in ZBrush, it automatically turns Colorize on for you. So that way, if I go over here and choose this cube, and let's say I want to fill that with a red, you're going to see when I choose a red color, these two objects that don't have colorize turned on, that little paintbrush is off. That means it's just going to inherit whatever material we have and whatever color we choose. You're going to see they're both going to update. However, with the cube selected, and I go in here to color, fill object with mRGB turned on, with RGB intensity turned up to 100, it is now going to fill this cube with a all red color and the plastic material. And we'll go ahead and choose a green color. We'll choose our arrow. We'll say color, fill object. So now all of our objects are filled with a plastic material, and all the verts of the sphere are filled with light blue. All the verts of the cube are filled with red. All the verts of the arrow are filled with green. Now this is Polypaint, so if I alt tap the sphere to select it, or select it in my subtool menu here, and again, with our standard brush, let's just turn on RGB, so we're just going to paint with color. We can go through here and we can Polypaint on this object. So if you want to, you know, go in here and like paint a, you know, a green to blue gradient on the sphere, you totally can. You're going to notice that, let's make this a little more obvious. You're going to notice that it's a pretty low res painting that you're doing. That's just because there's not a ton of verts on this object. It's pretty low res. However, you know, if you're not new to ZBrush, you can go in here to geometry, divide this up a couple times, and then go in here and Polypaint at a much higher resolution. However, I'm just going to undo back to where we just have our regular sphere here. So that's just to demonstrate with Redshift materials assigned to our objects and different colors, the Polypaint is going to determine what color our plastic objects are. And we'll go ahead and close this color menu down. Because this is chrome filled into our floor material, when I render this out, we're going to have different colored plastic objects with a chrome floor. Now, I mentioned new people to ZBrush. If you are new to ZBrush, I'm going to put this in the description. This is an intro to ZBrush series that'll cover a whole bunch of stuff that we're talking about, polypainting and masking and primitives and all that good stuff. So if you're a little bit lost, go check this out first and then come back in here and we'll talk more about Redshift rendering. Now, if you did like that functionality of, you know what, I just want to quickly test some colors and materials on our objects, all you got to do is go in here and you can turn off colorize. For example, if I turn off colorize for our sphere, it's going to inherit this dark blue color in our plastic material. If I change this back to white, it's going to be a white plastic. And if I hold down shift and turn on, it'll turn colorize on for everything. If I hold down shift and turn it off, it'll turn colorize off for everything. So if, for instance, if you wanted to go in here and say, you know, choose a green color and maybe aluminum as your material, with colorize off, you can very quickly turn all of these objects into green aluminum materials rendered over a white chrome plane. Now, if you want to stop a render before it's done, just hit escape and it'll pause that render. And then of course, if you move this around, it'll get rid of that render altogether. So again, if I want to go back to colorize, just hold down shift, turn colorize back on, and we're back to our plastic material colors. Even though we have aluminum chosen, the material is assigned to our objects, so they're not going to change because we have colorize turned on. So now, just like I said, if you kick off a render by hitting Shift R, hitting BPR, and you want to pause it, so we go ahead and let this it renders from the center out. So you can go ahead and just let that render. And if you want to just stop the render, just hit escape. And you can use this as kind of a preview of what your render is going to look like. Alternatively, you can also, instead of hitting Shift R, which renders your whole scene, you can hit Control R, and that will do a render region. So it'll go through and render just the spot where your cursor is. Now, when I do kick off that render, I'll do another Shift R. You're going to notice our sphere looks really good. It's nice and smooth and looks like plastic. However, these objects, they do look like plastic. They are smoothish, but they have some really bizarre rendering errors. So let's talk about why that is. So if I go in here and kind of zoom in, you're going to see this object right here isn't that high res. My active points is up here. Yours is probably over here to the right. But, you know, it's 8,000 polygons. You can see the faceting in the polygons. And of course, if you want to, like we did earlier, you can divide this up and make it smoother and sculpt on it or paint on it if you'd like. But if I undo that, if I were to, you know, when I render this out, it rendered smooth. The reason that is if we go here to the subtool menu and we scroll down, you're going to see there's a Redshift Properties assigned to every single subtool. And in here, smooth surface is turned on. Now, when I turn this off, look at this apply last action. So when I turn this off, that's going to become available. So if I want to turn smooth surface off for all my objects, I can turn it off for one, hit this button and hit OK, and now smooth surface is turned off for all of my objects. So now if I kick off another render, you're going to see we're not getting a very smooth sphere anymore, but at least we're not getting those weird shading errors on these objects. However, they are really sharp and faceted, so they look very CG and not very realistic. So let's talk about how we can fix that. If you have a very smooth, organic shape, and you don't feel like, subdividing it, you can go ahead and just leave that smooth surface on. So for this sphere right here, I'm just going to go ahead and turn that on. However, let's go ahead and choose our arrow, and we're going to go into solo mode. Your solo button might be a little bit different place, but I'm going to click that solo button on, and we're also going to turn on polyframe here, and we're going to zoom in a little bit on this object. So what's happening is when this thing is sent over and it smooths the normals, because this geometry is pretty low res, it's giving us some bruising on those on the shading of this object. So what we can do, if you're familiar with box modeling, we can go through and put in these, well, it already has control loops built in, but we're going to update the geometry on this a bit to make it a little bit more compatible with like a subdivision object. So what I'm going to do is hit B on my keyboard to bring up our brush menu, Z to narrow it down to brushes that start with Z, and you'll see Z modeler brush is M on our keyboard, so we can just hit M to choose that. We'll say, skip that note. And then let's go ahead and rearrange some of these, we'll call them control loops. So I'm going to hover over an edge with our Z modeler brush selected. I'm going to hold down spacebar, and we're going to change it from insert to slide, and we're going to say slide edge loop complete. So when I do that, I can go through here, and I'm going to move these control loops a little closer to the corners here, and I'm going to move this one a little further in. And this is going to hold our edges for our arrow. So if I want to hold this point, I'm going to move this out. Now on this back here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hover over this edge, and I'm going to hold down space bar. And instead of slide, I'm going to say bevel edge loop complete. So now when I click and drag on that edge, it'll add a bevel to our object here. And then I'm going to go back in, hover over this edge, move it back to slide edge loop complete, and then we'll go ahead and move these control loops out. And in fact, just to hold these edges a little bit better and make the surface a little bit more predictable, I'm going to hover over this edge, and we're going to say insert multiple edge loops, keep polygroup, and we're going to click and drag, and we're going to insert some edge loops along here just to even the surface out, basically. So we're going to click and drag on here and just introduce if you click and if you just tap, it's going to insert the edge loops, the number of edge loops for your previous operation. If you click and drag, that'll allow you to kind of insert one there. In fact, if you're new to ZBrush and you don't know what the Z modeler brush is, again, go to this playlist, and if you scroll down, you're going to see there are videos dedicated, 33 through 35 will talk about Z modeler brush and dynamic subdivision, which we're going to talk about right now. So we've updated this geometry to be a little bit more compatible as a subdivision surface. However, if I were to just render this now, it would render faceted because, again, it's not smooth. However, in ZBrush, again, we could go in here to geometry and hit divide a bunch of times and smooth the surface out, but it's destructive, right? You can go in here now and you can sculpt on the surface or paint on the surface better because there's more geometry there. But if I wanted to go through and add more edge loops or extrude some faces, I won't be able to because I have subdivisions on here. So instead of subdividing, what I'm going to do is go down here to dynamic subdivision, turn that button on, and if I hover over this, you'll see the hotkey for that. Actually, you won't see that. The hotkey for this is D to activate it and Shift D to turn it off. So when I hit D, it's going to say, do you want to activate dynamic? Say yes. So Shift D will turn it off and D will turn it on. This is just a preview. And if you look over here, when you turn this on, it's just giving you a preview of what this object would look like if you hit subdivide twice. So to make this really smooth, let's make that 3 times. So now we have a preview of what this would look like smooth with our sub D control loops built in, and we're getting a much nicer result on this object here. So now let's go out of solo mode and let's talk about this cube right here. So if I turn on polyframe for the cube and I go down here, again, we could, divide this cube up, and you're going to see it's going to get smoother, but it is also kind of giving us a huge fall off on here. So it's a very rounded edge cube. So let's undo that. And again, let's go ahead and use dynamic. So if we turn on our polyframe here and we turn on dynamic, you're going to see it's giving us a preview of what it would look like if we subdivided this twice. However, we want to maintain the corners a little bit more than it's allowing us now. Instead of adding control loops, let's do another option. So let's turn off dynamic. Let's go down here to the crease menu underneath geometry crease, and you're going to see there's a crease tolerance. Go ahead and leave that set to 45 and hit the crease button. What that's going to do is all of the major edges of your object are going to be creased. You're going to see these little dotted lines along here. That's going to tell ZBrush, keep those edges sharp. So now if I hit dynamic, it doesn't really look like anything changed because our crease level is set to 15. So what we can do is if we set this crease level like to 1 and our SmoothSubdiv is set to 2 in our dynamic, if we hit dynamic off or hit Shift D, that'll turn it off, and then D to turn it back on. Basically what we're telling ZBrush is subdivide our object twice. We have SmoothSubdiv set to 2. However, for our creases, only keep those creases for that first subdivision, uncrease everything, and then subdivide it one more time as a preview. So between these two objects, let me go ahead and turn polyframe off so you can see a little bit better. With crease level set to 1 and SmoothSubdiv set to 2, that's the result we're getting. And we're still getting a little bit of faceting on this object here. So let's say SmoothSubdiv of 4. Now we're getting a very smooth object, but we're still getting a pretty rounded corner, right? Well, all we need to do is increase this crease level up. So if I say crease level of 2, it's going to get a little tighter. If I say crease level of 3, it's going to get a little bit tighter. And if I finally say crease level of 4, this crease level is the exact same as the SmoothSubdiv. Now we're back to razor sharp CG edges because these are the same number. So to get a little bit of edge fall off and highlight, that's going to look a little bit more realistic, I'm going to say let's do crease level of 3, and then for a very smooth result, SmoothSubdiv of 4. So we do have pretty tight corners, but that's allowing us to catch a highlight, but it's not razor sharp, and it's not, you know, super lower. In fact, if we set this crease level to 0, that essentially gets rid of any creasing. Even though we do have creases on the object, it's ignoring them. But again, we'll set this to crease level of 3, SmoothSubdiv of 4. So now we have control loops with dynamic subdivision, we have creases with dynamic subdivision, and we have an object that just has Redshift properties. So if I Alt tap the sphere, the smooth surface is turned on. So now when I render our scene, we're going to get a smooth sphere because we have smooth surface on. We're going to get a nice smooth arrow because we have control loops and a dynamic subdivision being shown. And on this one, we have creasing and dynamic subdivisions as well. So now we're getting a much better result for our objects here. So we've talked about material assignments and we've talked about modeling, but let's talk about lights. Again, if I kick off that render, you're going to see not only do we have lights lighting our scene, we also have some sort of, I see a window over here and we got a reflection in our plastic. So there's some stuff going on here that we may not understand completely. So what's lighting our object? The most obvious one you may be thinking of is, well, if we go in here to our light menu and dock this over to the left, we do have a light turned on. So Redshift will render ZBrush lights in ZBrush, just like any other light in any other program that you render. It's just a light in your scene. Just so we can get a little bit of a better representation in our light right here that we can see a little bit better, let's change this from aluminum and we'll switch this over to plastic, which is what we're using on our objects. So like I said, we do have a light turned on, that intensity set to 0.85. So if we turn this light off by just clicking on it and then we re-render, you're going to see this is a little bit darker, but we still have tons of lights and reflections going on in here. You're also going to notice one more unfortunate thing. If we go in here to our material palette, you're going to see it looks like a bunch of them disappeared. So just tip, if for ZBrush, if you want to turn off a light, you can, but I would say go ahead and leave the main light on. But if you want to get rid of the effect of this main light, take that intensity and put it at like 0.001. That'll effectively turn that light off, but it'll allow your materials to kind of show up a little bit more normally. So we've essentially turned that light off. Why is our scene still being lit? Well, if we go down here to our render menu again, you're going to see use default panorama is turned on. If we turn that off and then we re-render, we have a very, very dark scene. So let's go ahead and leave default panorama off. We're going to get to a little bit more of what an HDR image is and how that works. But for now, let's just talk about ZBrush lights. So let's go ahead and take our intensity with our light selected, our main light selected. Let's turn that back up, let's say to 1. And you see, okay, our scene gets a lot lighter. If we want to move a ZBrush light around, you basically just take this dot in here and you're going to see as we update where this light position is, our materials are also going to update. So we can move this light around. If you want to send this light to the back of your object, just click on it once. That'll send it around to the back. And this is a great way to render out rim lights if you want to. Then just click it again to send it out front. So now if I hit BPR render, we're not getting any more like, window reflections or building reflections or anything like that. All we have lighting our scene now is that one ZBrush light. So like I said, Redshift can render ZBrush lights in conjunction with HDR images, which we'll get to in just a second. But let's talk a little bit more about ZBrush lights. So if you want to render with multiple ZBrush lights, all you got to do is go in here. For instance, I'm going to turn this fourth one on. If you tap it once, it's going to select that light and you can change the properties, but it's not going to turn it on. Touch it again or click it again, and that will turn the light on. So for this light down here, you're going to see the light position is way over here to the bottom right. It's got a blue color. It's got a 0.5 intensity. So now if I re-render, now you're going to see that blue light has been introduced. However, you're also probably going to notice a little bit, this blue light isn't casting a shadow. So if we go in here to light properties, you're going to see shadow is indeed turned off for this light. If I choose my main light, shadow is turned on. And in fact, if we go in here to Redshift light properties, this shadow button is the exact same for both. So again, if we go back here and we want to turn the shadow on for the blue light, you can do that. Just turn shadow on, but we'll go ahead and leave that off. And in fact, we'll go ahead and turn that light off. So we'll tap that one more time. And then to change the settings of our main light, we'll select that main light again. Again, we have our intensity set to 1. Shadows is turned on. We can change the light position, which we've already talked about. However, because ZBrush isn't like other programs, you can't go in here and like move a light closer or further away from an object, like with a move gizmo or anything like that. But what you can do is go down here to light distance. You can see it's set to 1.1 by default. If we lower that setting, it's going to move the light closer to the object. If we crank that setting up, it's going to move the light further away. So that and the light range and the decay type and decay start, those are light settings that you can change for each individual ZBrush light in order to move it further or closer away to your object. So we'll set this back to 1.1. We'll kick off a render. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go down here to our render menu. Because right now this floor is chrome. I'm going to switch this out from that chrome material to a basic Redshift material. There we go. So a very simple scene. We have one shadow because we have one ZBrush light. However, you notice we're in a void. There's just a dark gray out here. If we go in here to our document, I'm just going to dock this over to the side. That's being controlled by this back swatch. So if you click on the back swatch and then you go through here and you just hover over any color, you can, if you want to do a green screen, you can, choose a green, or you can go through here and choose a different color gray. So this back document back is what's controlling what is the background of here as far as your ZBrush document. We'll get into HDR images in just a second. Now, while we're in document here, you're also going to notice we have a document size. So let's say we wanted to render out a 1920 by 1080 full HD image of our object or movie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this width, we're going to type in 1920 and hit enter. And you're going to see it shows 1407 for us. Well, we want 1080. So I'm going to turn off Pro, that's proportion, constrained proportions. And I'm going to change this to 1080, hit enter, and then hit resize, say yes. And that's going to kind of give us a weird result. So we're going to hit Control N to clear our canvas, drag our objects back out, go into edit mode or hit T, and then we'll go ahead and reposition this. Now, how do I know, this is obviously not HD proportions. So how do I know where my image border is? So if I go in here to our document menu, I click zoom and just kind of click and drag on this button and zoom out. You're going to see, okay, here is the border of our 1920 by 1080 image. So just to ensure that your objects are positioned correctly within this frame, you're going to want to zoom out. If you hit actual, that'll go to the actual pixels of your document. Now, when we're talking about rendering, one of the ways you can speed up rendering is by changing the pixel dimension of your image. So we do eventually want to render a 1920 by 1080 image, but let's say we're going to do like a smaller render just to kind of get a faster render. And then once we're good, then we'll up our document and do a slower render for the higher pixel dimensions. So all that means is if I go in here, I'm going to turn Pro back on because we've got our pixel dimensions, our proportions dialed in, and we'll change this to, we'll do like 720 by 405, click resize, say yes, take Control N to clear our canvas, drag our object back out, go into edit mode. And now when I go in here and hit BPR or Shift R, that's going to kick off a render and it's going to be very fast. I mean, obviously it's going to be a lot smaller, and if we can actually zoom in on it, and you're going to see it's going to look a little bit grainy because, you know, we're rendering a very small image, but it's going to go pretty fast. So this is one way to speed up your render. And then if you want to say, okay, now I want to do my final render at, let's say, 1280 by 720, we'll click resize, Control N, and now we can do our final render of our image, but still have a pretty good idea of what our materials and lights and textures are going to do. Now, let's say we want to go back to having our entire document here filled with just our document area that's exposed, filled with pixels. So while we're working, all you got to do is go up here to W size and then click New Document, say No, Control N to clear your canvas, drag it back out, and now we're back where we started. We have our visible document is only this big, and we're going through here and we're rendering. So this is a way where you can render to a specific pixel dimension for your images, as well as if you want to knock this down quite a bit, get a faster render. So let's go ahead and close our document here. And let's talk more about that default panorama. So with our main light selected, let's again turn this off by typing in 0.001, hitting enter. And that's going to essentially turn that light off. And then let's turn on this use default panorama and let's re-render. So we have no more ZBrush lights, and now our entire scene is being lit by what's essentially is a dome. So if I scroll down to this here, and again, this is the same Max Miyamoto Blender Cinema 4D. You're going to see in Cinema 4D we have an RS dome light, and essentially that's a dome around our scene that has an image applied to it, and it's going to use that image for a reflection as well as for light. So you're going to see I'm going to double click this image here, and that's going to assign it to that dome, and then I can rotate this dome around and it's going to update our reflections and our lighting on our object. The exact same thing is happening in ZBrush. Incidentally, if I'm going to put this in the description as well, if you want to do ZBrush, send your stuff from ZBrush to Cinema 4D and render in there. I've got a whole series on that. That also includes things like physics. We make a bouncy, squishy SpongeBob and a fluffy, foamy SpongeBob and render a ship in a bottle and all that good stuff. So I'll leave that in the description if you want to check that out. But back in ZBrush, again, that default panoramic image is being loaded into a dome in ZBrush and lighting our scene. However, let's say you want to load in your own custom dome that'll light your scene. Go back up to the light menu, go in here to background, and there's two ways you can load something up. You can go in here to texture, import, and you can load up any HDR images you have downloaded from the internet or created yourself. I happen to know where the default panorama is. It's under C, Program Files, Max on ZBrush 2025, Z Data, Redshift. So we go to that folder. You're going to see there's an EXR file in here that we can double click. And because we went to texture import, it's just going to throw it out here in our texture palette. In order to load it into our background, we have to go in here to texture and then select it. Speaking of, if you go in here to background, click on this texture, you can also just import it directly in there. Just go in here to import and then double click your EXR file. So let's go ahead and load that up. And now that default panorama that is turned on down here, we've kind of just loaded it up in our background. This texture import method or texture import method is how you bring in any custom one. It's going to be the exact same process. So now that we have something loaded in, I'm going to go down here to render, and we're just going to turn off use default panorama. So now under background, it's turned on. We have a image loaded in here. If I hover over it, you're going to see this is the image that's mapped to that dome that surrounds our scene. So now if I click BPR, we can now see the image that's causing the lighting in our scene to happen. Another way to bring things in is if we hit the comma key on our keyboard here, and we go in here to texture, and we double click panoramas. ZBrush ships with a bunch of default panoramas. And if you click on any one of these, you're going to see that's the location of the EXR file. And if you double click it once, nothing's going to happen. If you double click it again, because this is an EXR file, ZBrush is smart enough to go, oh, an EXR file, you probably want to throw this into the background, and it does it for you. And you're going to see everything's all set up. Also take special notice of the gamma set to 2.2 for this EXR file. If you were to come in here and say, grab this Vancouver JPEG, if you double click this, the first time you double click, it's not going to do anything. Double click it again, And instead of automatically throwing this JPEG into your background, because it's a JPEG, it's going to throw it into your texture palette. So let's hit comma to get rid of our Lightbox. If we want to load this up as our background image, we can go ahead and say texture, turn that off. It's just sitting here in our palette. But we have to go in here manually into our background and say, select that panoramic image. Now, because it's a JPEG, it will swap this out, and you can use JPEGs to, render the lighting in your scene. However, notice it set that gamma to 1. So if we go back in here and we double click that Gnomon Interior EXR, it's going to throw that in here. However, your gamma is still set to 1. Let's go ahead and put that back to 2.2. So just keep an eye on that setting. Now, you're also going to see in here you have exposure, redshift exposure, shadow settings in here. You can go ahead and change any number of those things. But I'm going to go ahead and leave them at their defaults. Now in here, you see something called light caps, and you see a bunch of light cap menus. If you do want to know more about that, there is a ZBrush image-based lighting thing that you can go and watch. I'll put that in the description as well. So we have an image lighting our object. If we go down here to like latitude, longitude, and tilt, if you change any of these, it's going to rotate that image as well as update the lighting on your object. So you can go through here and you can kind of just, again, rotate this image around like so. Also, rotate with object is turned on. So if I go into my viewport and then just move this around, you're going to see I can just rotate in my scene. So if I want to like put these objects on the floor over here, I can do that. And then I can turn off rotate with object. So I've rotated my dome image with my object, but now I've decoupled it. So now I can just rotate my object around. So always feel free to go in here and, play around with these positions here, or turn on rotate with object if you want. You're also going to notice there's an on button. If you turn this off, it's just going to turn it off for your viewport. If I kick off a render, you're going to see it's still going to render our reflections and lighting and dome image. It's just not going to be visible in your viewport. If you want to get rid of this entirely, just go in here and say texture off, and that will get rid of your HDR image. But we'll go ahead and say background on. We've got our object settled in our scene. And like you noticed, if I'm just hit Control R to do a region render, again, this floor plane here is just set to a basic material. So if I want to make these objects look like they're sitting in this scene, what I can do is I can take this floor material and turn it into a shadow catcher. So again, you know how to switch out materials now. If we go in here to render, here is our floor material being used. Go in here, it's set to basic right now. Let's go in here and turn on shadow catcher. We'll assign the shadow catcher material to our floor plane, which again is this right here, Shift P or turn on your floor button. So now when I hit BPR, instead of rendering out a plane with a material assigned, it's only going to allow shadows on the floor plane to show up. Pretty cool. So now it looks like our object's kind of sitting in our scene. There's a few problems. One of them is you're going to see our shadow gets cut off here. So if I go through here and move our viewport, you're going to see if we go in here to draw, our grid size isn't big enough. So take your grid size and just crank that up. Alternatively, if you don't want to use this floor, you can just turn that off. And like we mentioned earlier, you can go in here and say append a plane. Oh, here's another thing too. If I turn off perspective, you're going to see the background goes a little bit nuts. That's just, turning perspective off just does that. So just turn perspective off to get your image back. Select the plane, hold down Shift and rotate this plane. And then we'll put it at the bottom of all of our objects and we'll scale it up. So right now, this plane, it has Colorize turned off. It's just going to inherit a plastic material. Let's go ahead and turn perspective back on. However, you can go in here and choose the shadow catcher material. And then with the plane selected, let's go back to our standard brush. We'll turn on M, go color fill object. So with our floor off, but with a plane with shadow catcher assigned to it, it will behave the same way. So if you don't want to use your floor plane, you can just import your own plane, assign a shadow catcher material to it, and get the exact same result. There you go. Now, while you're rotating it around, if you do want to kind of see through this floor plane, go in here to transparent and then turn on ghost, and then you'll be able to see through, actually, let's see, ghost turned on. You'll be able to see through your floor plane as you're kind of moving stuff around. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and take this plane and delete it. And we're going to go ahead and stick with our oversized floor grid here. And we'll go ahead and turn off transparent. Now, just so we're clear, if I go in here to our material, Let's go ahead and switch over here to our plastic material. You can turn technically any material into a shadow catcher. So again, with our plastic material selected, if I go in here to our material modifiers and I go down to the very bottom here, you're going to see is shadow catcher is an option. So if you switch this to 1, it will turn your plastic materials into shadow catchers. But we'll go ahead and switch this back to 0. Just wanted you to be aware that that was available. So now there was one more problem with this render. And that is we've got shadows, which is great, but you're going to see in the image itself, there's the floor is pretty shiny. It's actually reflecting these objects. That just means we need to go into our shadow catcher material. So let's go ahead and select that material. And then again, we're going to go into our material. We'll dock this over here. And under the modifiers, let's crank our metalness up to 1 and take this reflection roughness and make that a pretty low value. So now when I re-render this, now we're getting now you're starting to see our object being reflected in our floor plane here. Now, let's say you wanted to compare 2 renders. You know, again, if I was to go through here and say, you know what, let's make this, it's maybe, let's see what it looks like a little rougher. So we crank this roughness up. It's going to dump us back out in this view, and then we can kick off another render. And it looks a little bit rougher, but I'd like to compare it to our previous render. How do I do that? Well, let's go down here to our render menu. And right here at the top, you're going to see there's a render recall. If I open up the modifiers here, every single time we render, and we've rendered 34 times so far, it stores the image as well as the material setting, light setting, color material, and filter settings. So basically, if I click this little back arrow, and you can assign hotkeys to these if you want, if we click back one, you're going to see that it's kind of a little bit rougher and a little bit blurrier. If I go back one, it's a little bit sharper. If I go back one more, the reflections disappear entirely, because remember, this is before we had any metalness or any roughness assigned, or the roughness was very broad. So now we have reflections that are very shiny, and now they're pretty broad. And you can do the exact same thing with a spot render. So if we go back here to our metalness settings, and we'll take this reflection roughness and make it a very small value. If you do Control R and do a render region, so we hear a very sharp shiny, and then we go in here and we crank up this reflect roughness to like 0.5, and then do another Control R. There, it's blurry to the point where you almost don't even see it. Again, you can go back down here and look at the previous and look at the current. Now, if I like the shinier better, I'm just going to roll this back one and then re-render. It's going to take all of these render settings, and that's number 35. Number 36 was the blurry. This is going to store this new render as number 37. So you're going to have an entire history of every render you've done up to the last 100 that you can always roll back and steal those settings from previous renders. So not only can you compare, you can also steal the settings from all of these options here. Now, let's talk about the renderer itself. What I mean by that is if we go back to our render menu, and again, we kick off a render, it's going to go through and starts in the middle, and it's going to get every single square that it's rendering is being fully rendered. This is called a bucket render. So it's going to go through and make all these little squares, and it's going to completely render every single square. That's the default render within Redshift, at least when you're using ZBrush. And when you're using the bucket renderer, you're going to have a couple options in here. You're going to have error threshold and render quality and denoising. If you hover over this, you can see render quality. If you hold down Control while you're hovering over this menu, it'll give you a little bit more information. Essentially, this is going to up the raise, and if you make this higher, it's going to take longer to render. If you make it lower, it's going to render faster. You also have an error threshold, and this doesn't give you a ton of information. It actually doesn't give you any information at all, but if you just hover over this, you're going to see a larger number is a faster render, a smaller number is a slower render. So let's test out what this does. So if I crank up this error threshold to 1, and we kick off another render, instead of taking about, if you look up here, it'll give you the time. Instead of taking 9 seconds, it'll take 4 seconds. However, you're going to notice, let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit, and we'll kick off another render. You're going to notice the bucket render goes a lot faster. It's rendering a lot faster. However, when it's done, it's a lot more grainy. The end result, you're going to see there's some splotchiness in the sphere. That's just noise being introduced. Now, it kind of looks smooth here, so the noise isn't universal. However, if we go over here and we turn off the denoising option, this is a post-process. So essentially what it's doing is it's kicking off a render, and it's, when it finishes bucket rendering, you're going to see when it's done, there's a lot of noise still in here. And that's because we turned denoising off. If this is on and you kick off the exact same render, you're going to see it's going to go through and re-render. And then when it's done, it's going to go boop, and it's going to denoise it for you. So this is, again, it's happening after the render. Now, here's a pro tip. If you're using the bucket render, again, you can do Shift-R, click the BPR button. If you happen to be centered on the object you want to render, just hit Escape. And then what that's going to do is stop the render and then apply the denoise. So it's kind of like a region render where you hit Control-R, only it's happening in this area here. So that's just a quick way to kind of go through and do iterative rendering with the bucket render. So basically with the bucket render and denoising, what you can do is you can kind of play around with the speed and quality. You can go through here and say, you know what, the error threshold by default is 0.01. Maybe that's a little slow, but maybe if I crank this up a little bit, I'll get a slightly faster render that's fast enough. And then with denoising applied, it's good enough. So again, if I hit Escape and stop it, this is pretty good. It's nice and smooth. It's rendering faster than the 0.01. I'm not really turned off too much by the splotchiness, or I know that I can get iterative rendering going on quickly. And then when I'm ready for my final render, then I can go down here and, put this error threshold at a much lower number. Even increase my render quality, let it sit and churn and make me a very, very nice render once I've kind of gone through and done a bunch of test renders. Now, this bucket render, again, it's only going to go through and make a bunch of squares that kind of fill in with a final render. There is another option. So we can go over here. We'll turn on progressive rendering. You're going to see when I do that, it turns render quality off. That's only for our bucket render, but it is going to turn off this progressive iterations. And just like the bucket render, it does use denoising. So, if you hover over this and you hold down Control, it'll give you a little bit more information. Basically, the higher this number is, the better the quality is. The lower this number is, the lower the quality. So if I keep it at 64 and I hit BPR, instead of doing a bunch of buckets, it's going to render your entire scene. And then it's just going to kind of slowly res in, and then it's going to apply that denoise right when it's done. So now, instead of, like I said, doing a bunch of little square renders, it's going to render your entire scene. You can use that to your advantage as well. If you kick off a render and you don't want to sit there and wait for it to finish, just hit Escape. It'll be a little noisier, but it'll apply the denoise, and you can go a little bit faster. Of course, like I said, you can turn this progressive render down to 1. And just to show you what this really looks like, go in here and turn off denoising. And with progressive iteration set to 1, hit BPR. And it's going to be a very noisy image. If you turn on denoising and kick it off, it's going to be very fast. It'll render almost instantaneously, but the image is going to be really, really low quality. But again, just like the bucket render, if we set this to maybe 25 and have denoising turned on, this might be good enough just for a quick iterative render. It'll go through, it'll render for 3 or 4 seconds, and then stop, and then apply the denoise. So again, just like the bucket render, you can kind of play with these settings to see, kind of balancing speed and quality. I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 64. And I'll leave it up to you. If you want to use the bucket render or the progressive rendering, it's up to you. I guess I'll leave it on progressive render. Now, if you want to know more about the GI bounces and engine stuff, you can just go into the Maxon documentation. It'll walk you through all of, what engines use, what settings, and what they actually do. But the default settings should work pretty good for most of your needs. Now, there is one thing I wanted to mention. We did change the shadow catcher material. So if I go in here and we look at our materials here, we have our shadow catcher material selected. We've gone through and we've added metalness. The reflection roughness, I'm going to turn that up just a little bit more because it's very, very shiny. I think this will be fine. So again, we have a nice, shiny floor catching material. But if I were to restart ZBrush and load up a shadow catcher material, it would revert back to our normal material settings. So let's say I want to save this material for later. Or every time I start up ZBrush, I want 2 shadow catchers. I want the original shadow catcher, and then I want a shiny shadow catcher. So what I'm going to do is with our updated shadow catcher selected, I'm going to go in here to the material menu, hit save. And if I go to C Program Files, Maxon ZBrush 2025, if I go in here to Z Startup, Materials, if I go in here and say, shadow catcher shiny and hit save, every time I start up ZBrush, there will be a shadow catcher shiny probably thrown over here in the very back end of the Redshift Polypaint Materials. If I don't want it to start up with ZBrush, but I do want it available to me, another place to save your materials is go in here to Materials Save. you can go into ZBrush, Max on ZBrush 2025, Z Materials, and you're going to see there's some default folders. In fact, there's a Redshift folder in here. So we can say Shadow Catcher Shiny Material. We'll go ahead and save that in there. So now if we hit our comma key, go into the Material menu, go into Redshift, there is our Shadow Catcher Shiny. So when we restart ZBrush, our Shadow Catcher Shiny will be in here and on startup. Or if you just want to get it, go and grab it every once in a while, you can hit the comma key, go into your Material tab, and then go to wherever you saved it. And you can save, if you go into Windows Explorer, if you go in here to Z Materials, you can right click, make your own custom folder in here, put whatever you want in there, and it'll show up just as you would expect in your Lightbox. Now let's talk a little bit about depth of field. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this material and the light menu, and we'll just focus on the render menu here. Down at the kind of the midway through is depth of field. So let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit, and actually we'll alt tap our sphere and we'll move that further away from our other objects here in our scene. So now if I turn depth of field on, you're going to see there's a focus depth slider. If I just click on that slider and then drag into our scene, you're going to see as I drag over these objects, that number is going to update. So if I want to focus on, say, this red cube in the foreground and have everything else blur, the further away it gets from that point, just click and drag on this slider and then drag onto the object. And your focus radius, if we kick off a render here, is going to be how blurry it is. And if you hover over focus radius and hold down Control, it'll tell you the lower the number is, the more in focus objects are going to be, and then the higher the number is, the blurrier they'll be. So if I take this from 5 and then crank it up, so this is with 5, and if I crank this up and hit BPR and say 17, now objects that are further away are going to be even blurrier. And again, if we go up here to our render recall, we can go back 1 and forward 1. Just so you know, under modifiers, there is no depth of field stored in here underneath your render settings. So if you do, like, say, the focus radius of 5, it's not going to update in here. So you have to go back in here and say focus radius 5, hit enter. And you know what, let's talk a little bit more about materials. So we'll take our material and we'll just dock it back over here. And we'll switch back to our plastic material we were talking about that are assigned to all of our objects here. So with our plastic material that's assigned to all of our objects, if we scroll down, you're going to see use material color is set to 0. So if we go back into our materials here, you're going to see we have matte cap, standard, and then we have our Redshift Polypaint materials that we're currently using, and then Redshift preset color materials. With our plastic, right now it's in the Polypaint Materials section, and that's because this use material color is set to 0. If we set this to 1, it's going to turn all of our objects white because this base swatch right here is filled with a white color. And in fact, if we go back into our materials, it's moved our plastic material over here into our preset color materials. So if you save your own materials or create your own materials and you have this set to 0 or 1, that's going to determine where it gets organized. So when it's set to 0, that means it uses Polypaint. It's not going to override your Polypaint, and it's going to be up here. So what that means is if I alt tap on our sphere here, and again we'll hit Control D a couple times to get more polygons, and all I'm doing when I hit Control D is it's just subdividing up to get more vertex resolution. So with our standard brush selected, we're going to choose RGB because we want to paint. I'm going to hit C to sample that light blue color, and then we'll do a kind of a yellow color. So we'll put some yellow dots, and then we'll choose maybe an oranger color here. So we're polypainting on our object, and you're going to see the polypainting is updated, and when we hit Control R to do a render region, it renders a plastic material with our Polypaint driving the color. Now again, if I say use material color set to 1, that's going to use this color swatch. So if I go through here and make this blue, now it's a blue plastic. So if I do Control R, it doesn't matter what the Polypaint is, it's just going to render whatever that base color is. Now, if I have a blue color in there and I say, okay, I actually want to use my Polypaint, so I'll put this back to 0, you're going to see it's going to mix that blue base color with our Polypaint. So if you just want to use your Polypaint to color your object, make sure this base swatch color is set to pure white, and that way just your Polypaint will be shown. So when you go in here and you look at these plastics in the preset color materials, those are set to use material color, and they have a base color plugged in. In fact, if we select one, you're going to see, there we go, use material color is dialed in, and that base color is chosen. So let's take that sphere, and I'm going to take my undo history slider. We're just going to drag that back until it's back to where it was originally, with smooth surface turned back on. And I'm going to hit W, and then we're going to duplicate that sphere. We're going to move this sphere, a duplicate of the sphere up, and we're going to scale this down. And we're going to put a sphere right above here. For this new smaller sphere, I'm going to choose a basic material. We're going to choose a white Polypaint color. We're going to do mRGB, and we're going to say color fill object. So now this smaller sphere is filled with just a basic material with a white color. And again, under the material menu, we have the basic material selected. All of these options in here, they're pretty self-explanatory, and I'm going to link you to the documentation for the standard material in Redshift to go through all the options here. And in fact, if you want to play around with these options on this model, if you hit the comma key on your keyboard to go into Lightbox, go into Project, and then scroll to the right, you're going to see there's a Redshift Demo Test Z project. You can double click this. That'll load up an entire Redshift scene that's ready for you to test your render material properties. And this is really good documentation. If you scroll down, there's animated GIFs and sliders that explain what all of these things are doing. And they should be named pretty similar to what you have over here in ZBrush. But just to kind of show you, for example, we have the basic material here. If we want to make this shinier, we can take this reflect roughness down and the diffuse roughness down, and that'll make it the overall image or the overall material shinier. And you're going to see in here there's a reflect color weight. If we crank that up, that's going to make it shinier as well. However, this reflect color is telling you there is a reflection color that you can change. If you go in here to reflect color and make that red, your reflections will be tinted. If we zoom in a little bit, your reflections on this material will be tinted red. And just so you can see this a little bit better, I'm going to hit Control D. So here we have reflections and they're tinted red. If you don't like that, go in here to reflection color, make that white. Or alternatively, you can leave this red if you want, but I believe if you take this reflect color weight down to 0, that reflect color won't have any effect. So for our shiny object, we'll just set this to white, reflect color weight to 1, and then you can play around with the reflect roughness to make that a rougher object or a shinier object. You're also going to see a bunch of things in here: reflection, IOR, index of refraction. For the refraction here, if you have a glass material, this is really important. So if we switch this from basic to a glass, and we say, again, color, fill object, and we go ahead and let's do Control R to do a region render. Here you can see we have a nice shiny glass reflecting the sphere in the bottom here. In fact, we'll go ahead and just do a scene render. There we go. And where it's getting these refraction numbers, I'm going to have more documentation in the description of this video. But if you want to look at index of refraction values, for example, for glass, let's go hit G on this website. That'll take us down to the G's. And glass, you're going to see the index of refraction set to 1.5. And that, of course, is in here. Here's another one. This one's really cool. If you go here to Shelf, click on this 3D selected data for 3D artists, and you're going to have a bunch of metals. So if you go through here, here's aluminum, iron, gold. And if we look at glass, there's a whole bunch of different types of glasses you can choose. That refractive index is 1.5168. So like liquid water is usually like 1.333, iron's 2.95, glass is 1.5, etc. Now there is one more option here. Let's switch this back to our basic material. And then again, we'll do another color fill object for our little sphere here. For things that have weight or amount, like the subsurface scattering amount, if that's set to 0, there's not going to be any subsurface happening going on. There's not going to be any coat here. That's not going to happen. Emission, nothing's going to happen if it's set to 0. But if you do want your coat to show up, set that coat weight to a number higher than 0, and it'll show up, and you can change those settings. Same thing for sheen, same thing for SSS, crank that SSS amount up, and you'll start seeing subsurface scattering, and then you can go through and play with these. This is important. For subsurface scattering, there's going to be a front color. So we're going to choose, this is like what's under the surface, and then this back color is going to be, after light passes through, what's seen on the other side. And then depending on the scale, Cinema 4D is at a centimeter scale, ZBrush is at a millimeter scale. So depending on the scale of your objects, going in here and changing your scale to get the appropriate amount of subsurface scattering is important. And then the SSS amount. Phase is going to put it closer to the surface in a positive value, or negative is going to be deeper in. All subtools or the individual object. Subsurface scattering mode, if we click this all the way to, so 0 is point-based diffusion. It's fast and clean, but not very accurate. 1 is ray trace diffusion. It's a little more accurate, a little more stable, increased render time. And then 2 is, if you're using subsurface scattering, that's probably what you should set it at. It's random walk. That's the most accurate method. And again, where I'm getting all of this information is right in here. We'll just do a click on subsurface here, and that's going to walk you through all the different settings and what things are going to look like when you're changing these values. So you may have to play with some of this, but again, the documentation is really good. It'll walk you through it. But again, if we change this SSS amount to 0, it doesn't matter what you have on here or what you have plugged in here, it's going to get rid of any subsurface scattering effect. And one more thing to talk about, emission weight. If we crank that up to 100, that's going to make this emissive. So all of these settings are going to kind of be overridden by this self-illumination that this object has. And in this case, if we want to self-illuminate, say, a really warm look, so let's say RGB color fill object, and then we do a Control R to do a region render, you're going to see that Polypaint really didn't do much. It's being overridden by the emissive intensity. So if you want to have a colored emissive, go in here to this emissive color swatch and then change this one to a color. And then when you render, now this object is self-illuminating and is being reflected and lighting the area around it. You're going to notice that emissive objects tend to introduce extra noise here. So you may need to go in, again, you know how to do this now, underneath render. We're using a progressive render. We're going to need to crank up this progressive iterations, make it a little less noisy. And then if we turn this off, we want to go back to bucket render. You may need to increase that render quality. Now in the quick start video, we went through making a turntable. Let's go ahead and animate our camera. So I'm going to delete this out of our scene. Let's simplify our scene quite a bit. I'm going to go into our light menu. I'm going to turn our HDR image off. I'm going to take our ZBrush light here and we're going to crank that intensity back up to 1. And instead of going into our movie menu here and making a turntable, I'm going to animate our camera. So if I go in here to timeline, I'm going to open up and turn on show. First, we need to make it so it's only our document being rendered, and we want it to be the full pixel dimension. So we're going to say large. And just like we explained at the very beginning, you can go in here to document and make your document size, if you want to do a 1920 by 1080, go ahead and set it in here if you'd like. But now we have a timeline track, and if we open up timeline tracks, you're going to see we're editing our camera position. So if I move our timeline back all the way to 0 and I set my camera, this is going to be the start position of our camera. If I go forward in time and then say we want to kind of zoom in a little bit, I can put a little dot there. And now when I go between, let's zoom out a little bit. Let's put a little dot here. So now I'm interpolating between these two values here. So if I go forward a little bit in time, and then maybe I'm maybe turn this camera around a little bit, and we'll put a dot, you can see we can go through and we can animate our camera over time. But of course, we want to use our Redshift renderer. And because we turned off our HDR image, let's go back down to our render properties. Instead of a shadow catcher, you know what? We'll just put on a plastic material there. And then under draw, we'll set this grid size back to 3. So it's going to have a plastic floor. And as we kind of go in, it'll be lit by a ZBrush light, and it's going to render these frames out. If we go back to movie, let's go to our title image. Let's take our fade in and fade out time and put that down to 0. For our duration, we'll set this to 10. Let's go ahead and kick off our Redshift render. And again, if you just want to do a test render that's maybe not super high quality, but it's good enough, remember you can go down here to your render settings. And again, we're back to using our bucket render. So let's crank our error threshold up. We'll keep denoising on. We'll crank our error threshold up. We'll do another quick render. That's pretty good. And one more thing we can do to speed things up, again, just for kind of a test render. Let's go to our document here. Let's say instead of 1300, we'll say maybe 800. Hit enter, resize, Control N to clear our canvas, drag it back out, go into edit mode. And now with our Redshift render kicked off and we got the nice looking image, all we have to do is Control Shift and tap our timeline slider, and it'll go through and render every single frame using Redshift while our camera animates. There we go. So we go back here and we say movie, play movie. It'll go through and play our movie. If you want to export it, turn on H for the highest quality. Say export. Let's throw this right on our desktop as ZBrush movie. And then now when we play this movie, there we go. We got our nice Redshift render. It looks like the camera settings got messed up a little bit, but that's probably user error on my part. But that's how you can go through, instead of doing a turntable, animate your camera. Now, while you're doing your BPR render with using Redshift, you can go through here underneath render. You can go through and add BPR filters. If you want to know more about BPR filters, my ZBrush 2019 What's New will walk you through a whole bunch of really fun things that you can do with this filter library. And one last thing to talk about is saving our scene. So if we want to save all of these options, two things we want to save. We want to go in here to render, save, and we can save our render settings. We'll say render preset. We'll store that on our desktop. And then to save our material settings and our subtools, go in here to file, save as. We'll save a Z project. And that way, when we go in, we say file open, we can load up everything in our scene that will have all our material, light, and subtool settings, and then any render settings that you had. You can go in here to render load, and then load that render preset, and you'll be right back where you started. So you made it through the entire hour plus video, and now you should have a pretty good idea of where all the menus and buttons are for Redshift. The next video we're going to go into is how to render passes using those BPR passes. We touched briefly on the BPR passes and the AOV renders. So we're going to go through and render something nice out and do a bunch of different render passes and composite all of that stuff in Photoshop or your compositor of choice. And then that'll kind of wrap up all of the Redshift and rendering and render passes for this 2025 What's New series.